Sorry about that. So we are now recording. And thank you so much, everybody, for letting us know where you're from, who your people are. And now we have a better idea of who's in space with us. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Morgan Hawes and Shayla to introduce themselves. They're going to be doing our modules today. So thank you, everybody, for sharing that important part about you. And I'll hand it over to you, ladies.
Thanks so much, Steph. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I have headphones connected right now. So thank you, Hilly, Holly Homahan, and I am Morgan Hawes, the National TTA Sex Trafficking Program Coordinator at MUSAC, and I am an enrolled member of the Picayune Rancheria of Chukchansi Indians. And I'm very honored to be here today to help with the 40 hour and providing this module for sexual violence in Indian country, looking at oppression specifically.
Dante Nisi Gaso and Shayla Beaumont. I'm an enrolled member of the Chippewa Cree tribe. I live here in Havre, Montana. I recently just moved from Missoula, Montana, but now I live like 10 minutes away from the Canadian border. I'm an enrolled member of the Chippewa Cree tribe, but I'm also Gros-Ventre, Assiniboine, and Crow. I've provided advocacy for sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, and my background is criminal justice. And I've always been passionate about expanding resources, not only for tribal reservations, but also culturally sensitive communities. And I'm really interested in decolonizing history. So really telling history through Indigenous lens. And I'm really excited to be with you all today and how we can move and plan forward in interrupting sexual violence and oppression. So get to tell me, and thank you.
Well, that was amazing, Shayla. I'll just say ditto. No, I'm just kidding.
Can we spotlight Shayla too? Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. And then also, Hercules, that reminds me, if anybody, we do have ASL interpreters. And so if we just want to be respectful for that accommodation and maybe breathe, slow down a little bit while talking, and so that the ASLs are not like getting tired out over there. And I love you, Shayla, but that I was like looking at Hercules trying to keep up with all that. I also wanted to let you know that we do have closed caption enabled today, and I apologize for not setting that up yesterday, but there is a closed captioning button. If you have any issues with navigating through that, please message me and I will help you.
Are we okay to get started, Steph?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. So this module again is sexual violence in Indian country within oppression analysis. So we're going to look at a history of sexual violence and some of the root causes and tactics. And I just want to sort of put this out there for everyone since this is a shared space, but due to the nature of the content that we'll be discussing, I'd really love if we can all center our energy and set our intentions for the session as a space to connect and engage with empathy and compassion for each other as we're co-learning. So if we can just take into consideration all of the different experiences that we bring, and that the words we speak and the ways that we express ourselves carry meaning. So if anyone's feeling activated or needs to take some space for themselves, please feel free to do that. So our goals and learning objectives for this module are to recognize again the root causes of sexual violence in Indian country and to understand the role of advocacy in creating change and restoring our communities to wellness. So we're really hoping to make the connection between colonization, right, and how it works to keep tribes powerless. So trying to understand some of the structures of power, impact of federal policies on our tribal ways of life, and how our work, how advocacy is overlapping and intersecting with these different sort of causes of and different pathways, right, that are sort of leading us to a space where we can reclaim and decolonize. So what does this look like, and how do we do it when we are up against institutions that we need to disrupt in order to reclaim our power? So some of the learning objectives specifically will focus on, again, recognizing the root causes of sexual violence, making these connections to colonization, understanding those power structures and dynamics that impact and dismantle tribal ways of life, and identifying how our advocacy is a critical component to create and sustain change in our communities. All right, so we're gonna dig in, and if I do go too fast, please let me know. But the first thing that we need to know or to clarify is that sexual assault is a crime, right? So any type of sexual act that causes discomfort or that lacks consent, that's how we're defining sexual assault in this regard. So contact or behaviors that occur without consent. This might include use of force, so physical violence or imposing force to gain access. This can include threats, intimidation, or coercion to overcome resistance. Coercion then would be defined as pressure, right? Unacceptable, inappropriate pressure for sexual activity. So it's more than just persuasion. It's something that's impairing a person's freedom or choice about whether they are going to or would like to engage in a sexual activity. And this can also involve threats. So there's sort of that use of threat and how it intersects with pressure and how folks are manipulated related to coercion. So thinking about maybe blame and guilt tripping or sulking when you might be rejection. And this could include tactics like gaslighting or emotional abuse, even things like spiritual abuse, and really leveraging positionality and power to coerce or manipulate someone and being able to control their behaviors. So knowing that sexual assault is a crime, I think one of the things to consider is, what do we mean by consent? So consent is about communication, right? Consent happens when all people involved in any kind of sexual activity exercise their rights to mutually agree upon taking part in a specific actions, right? So consent can be exchanged through words or action. But this really sort of involves freedom and capacity. So thinking really clearly about, are the people involved able to provide consent? And consent doesn't translate to all acts. So consent for one activity doesn't mean that implies consent for all. And past consent does not imply future or ongoing consent. And consent can be withdrawn at any time. So let's think a little bit more about what happens when people cannot provide consent. I would love if folks could utilize the chat to give some examples of ways that people might not, or reasons that people might not be able to provide consent. So I'm going to keep my eyes peeled on the chat, but if Steph, you were to see something and you want to shout it out, that'd be great too. Yes, exactly. If folks are intoxicated, if there's leveraging of that positionality and power, right? Medications. Maybe there's some impairments in other ways, different types of substances, or perhaps if someone mentions mental limitations. right? Age, so minors, vulnerable adults, exactly.
Someone
Yeah,
mentioned the
absolutely.
dynamic between the harm doer and the
Yes, yes. Thank you, Shayla, for mentioning that. Yep, disabilities, whether those are visible or invisible, right? That can impact folks' ability to consent. Yes, thank you so much. That's wonderful. You guys are right on. Okay, so we're thinking about consent. We're also thinking about, right, those elements that we were talking about, like force and coercion, manipulation, and motive, right? So how motive is power and control here. Not sure how familiar folks are with sort of the power and control, that wheel that we've seen before, right? But our bodies are sacred. They're ours, right? And part of that is that we bring, we bring life into this world as men, as women, as people, right? We have an energy force around us that unfortunately, like, some folks might take for granted, and not respect. And stripping away body sovereignty and inflicting harm is a way that people take advantage and gain power. And this can happen to anyone, right? So, no matter what identities that we hold, based on age, race, abilities, occupation, socioeconomic status, and this happens to folks in a number of different ways, and it's something that happens all over the world, right? It's not happening just in some places, it's happening all over, and we know that there's a prevalence and of this happening in our communities. So one of the things we think about, knowing that this can occur across the spectrum, is punishment, right? What does that look like for these crimes, because this is a crime? There's varying degrees of punishment and also what we might define as justice. So it's sort of, thinking about what kind of justice or punishment might survivors or victims be seeking. And so we know that the criminal justice system is a primary source of accountability for those who cause harm. But I'm wondering if folks can think of other forms of accountability that might be survivor centered, that aren't sort of related specifically to the criminal justice system. You can use the chat too, again, if you guys have anything that you can think of that might be a way of restoring justice, or yep, exactly. Yep. Peacekeeping circles. Yeah. So part of our work, right, in advocacy is to really be survivor centered and to meet the survivor where they're at. Just something to think about. We can talk a little bit more about that later, but what we know is that these acts of violence cause trauma, and that they impact many different facets of a victim or survivor's life. We can go to the next slide. Thanks. So we're looking at a page of statistics here. I personally love data and statistics, but it's not for everyone. And what does it even mean, right? We're looking at numbers, but we're talking about people that we work with, communities that we serve. So what do these statistics suggest? Well, they demonstrate prevalence, right? So the likelihood that a person or a group of people with shared identities or characteristics are going to experience some type of issue or phenomenon. And what we know and what we can extrapolate is that Native people, right, are experiencing some of the highest rates of violence compared to members of other race or minority groups. And this includes domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, trafficking. But there are also studies all over the world that show that Indigenous people where there are high rates of sexual violence, there's also a history, right? A legacy of colonization and historical trauma. So 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women and men have experienced violence in their lifetime. This is a study done by NIJ and published by Rose. We also see that 1 in 4 and 1 in 10 for non-natives are experiencing violence. So you can see that the rates are quite different. And 85% of Two-Spirit or LGBTQ folks have identified that they've experienced sexual assault. Now, just to be clear, these are structural issues embedded in our society that are impacting our people. But my question to all of you is, do we think that these statistics are accurate? Right? If you look at the references on the bottom in the citations, we can see that some of these are outdated. So I'm wondering, do you think that these statistics are still accurate? Do you think they're higher or lower? Yep. Thank you for saying that.
Morgan,
Absolutely.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just have a question. The first statistic, is that just straight violence, or is that also sexual violence? And the second, the 1 in 4 and 1 in 10, that's specifically about sexual violence, right?
So that came out of the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. So yeah, the 1 in 4, I believe, is specific to the sexual violence. And then we have the 1 in 10 also, and that's from the CDC. But the first study I know was part of a large project funded by NIJ, and we can share these resources too. I can provide links later on. But the 4 and 5, it was more of a prevalence of violence over the lifetime. So any type that encompassed all types of violence, domestic, sexual, stalking. And also it included like psychological abuse too in that study. So yeah, folks are saying that they think that, you know, given the information like being a bit outdated here, right? That, you know, and also due to perhaps non-disclosure, that these statistics are likely not an accurate representation of what we know people are experiencing in our communities, right? And there are a plethora of reasons for that. But what it sort of highlights, at least, you know, when I see these statistics, is that there's more work to be done, right? That the researchers really they have they have sort of a job here for them, right? Like not only just to pull the numbers, but also to tell the stories. Like, where is the narrative in this? Where is the experiences coming from the survivor, the victim, right? When we're looking at this data, it's telling us something, but there's a little bit more for us to discover. So I think that there's things that that we all know to be true, but in terms of accuracy, there's definitely room for improvement here. So on the second slide, we have one more slide specific to data. It suggests that what we know is Native women suffer the highest rates of sexual assault in the US. Again, this data is a little bit outdated, but that is still accurate. And approximately 84.3% of Native women and 81.6% of Native men have been raped or have experienced physical violence and or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And that was, again, from that study previously mentioned at the top of the last slide. And 56.1% of Native women and 27.5% of Native men have experienced some form of sexual violence. So those rates are a little bit more specific to your question earlier. Same study though. And like I said, we can probably send out that link. Okay, so now we're going to get into colonization. What is this? How does this impact the work that we're doing? And how does it manifest itself, right? So on this slide, we have a statement made by Lord Macaulay's address to the British Parliament in 1835. And he said, "I have traveled across the length and breadth of India," and this is specific to India, "and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Such wealth I have seen in this country, such high moral values, people of such caliber, that I do not think we could ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage. And therefore, I propose that we replace her old and ancient education system, her culture, for if the Indians think that all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they will become what we want them, a truly dominated nation. So in this way, we are sort of noting that we're going to use these terms a little bit interchangeably, but colonizer and oppressor. So why do you suppose countries want to dominate other nations? Like what might be reasons a government would choose to enact these policies or practices? And you can, again, use the chat if you want. Mm-hmm. So when we say resources, does anyone want to maybe take a guess at the different types of resources? Yeah. Yep. Water, oil, land, power control, religion. Yep. Food, coal, oil. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Laziness. Spices. Yep. Ink. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for sharing that. Yes, exactly. Thank you, Lori. People themselves, right? People, so commodities, what we would refer to, right, in the capitalistic sense as a commodity, and people are being seen and viewed and valued as commodities. So when we talk about reasons that governments justify this action, right, resources, the taking of commodities, the extrapolation, the extraction, the exploitation of people, we're really talking about power and control again, right? We're talking about linking colonization, really, essentially, in some ways, to capitalism and patriarchy. And when we talk about people as resources, right? You know, sometimes we use the example, or we hear the example of slavery, both in indigenous and folks who are Black or African American. And we're talking about the acquisition of bodies for the purpose of labor or reproduction. And when we're thinking about the land and the earth and what it provides to us, right? The foundation of life, sustenance, all of the resources that you guys mentioned, what we're really talking about is this concept of accumulation by dispossession. So taking of native land and resources and exploiting that for capital gain, right? Privatization, and really sort of connecting that back on a global scale, like the example that we have here in the address to Parliament, right? They're talking about India, the country, but it's really sort of emphasizing this concept of colonization and imperialism. So global expansion, right? Expansion of wealth across the globe through land and resources. You want to go to the next slide, please? Thanks, Deb. All right, so colonization, how are we defining this? We are defining it as a process by which a central system of power dominates and appropriates a given area. And when a powerful nation or group of people use the specific tactics or employ specific tactics that they have adopted, they then dominate the resources of the people or the groups of people or nation in order to strengthen or enrich themselves, right? They're accumulating this by taking it from someone else, and often forcibly. And they're promoting at the same time a set of beliefs where the values of the superior, or how they've deemed themselves to be superior group, the colonizers in this aspect, are really, they're saying, right, like these are the beliefs that should be held, that we are modeling these for you. So there's a video, and Debbie, if you would be able to bring that up, we're going to watch that video and then we're going to have a discussion after about it.
Okay, I'm gonna unshare my screen and then put the video up.
Okay, you can go back to the other slide though after. We still have a little
Okay.
bit on
Okay.
there. Thank
Yeah, I
you.
know. I'm just trying to find the, okay. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I grew up on the reservation, so my identity is I'm Northern Cheyenne, and my identity is complex because I got bussed off the reservation and went to a predominantly white school. And so I would come home and have Native culture, and then I would be bussed off and be immersed in dominant culture with English language. Come home, and my dad's first language is Cheyenne. I think my identities as a Mennonite and a Northern Cheyenne, I think they always go back and forth. They're constantly conflicting and they're constantly going together. But there's a lot of similarities, especially within this psychology of peace and peacemaking and reconciliation and restorative justice. Yet at the same time, there's some conflict because within the Christian community, it's still, I would say, from my own opinion, like predominantly the thought that you are a Native or a Christian. You can't really be both. And so if you want to be a Christian, you give up your Native identity. I grew up in Montana, but if you think about where tribes are now on reservations, that's only a portion of the land they occupied. So we were nomadic people, and our range would have been up into Canada, down into Kansas, Minnesota, that whole little loop. We were considered a plains tribe. And so through the process of colonization, then we get pushed to this little section of land on Montana. But a lot of our sacred sites, some are in Wyoming and some are in South Dakota. And so, and even down in Denver, we had the Sand Creek Massacre. And so our sacred sites and the places in which we memorialize cover a huge area. And we also have our other relatives, the Southern Cheyenne, live in Oklahoma because we were separated during the process of termination and all that stuff.
You know, our tradition is kind of rooted in being refugees, leaving Europe to find a safe place. And my family name is Stout. So the Stouts and the Orsburns migrated west, and they tried North Dakota, and then they tried Texas, and they ended up here. So I have some photographs in the house, you know, back from the early years of my family's time here. And, you know, you point to it with pride, and, you know, it's like, oh, we were hard stuff. We came here and settled and survived. And I took these photographs to a self-service frame shop in Seattle. And I needed help. And I asked the manager if he could help me out. And he looked at me and he goes, I know, I have pictures like these. Oh, really? Yeah, that's interesting. No. I mean, I know these people. We started comparing notes, and we're from the same valley. We had grown up together and didn't know each other. But he was the grandson of a woman who was the last Native in the area to remember life before the settlers came. So she was pretty famous. And it was kind of a mystery that we didn't know each other. And we spent probably 5 hours that day just talking. But one of the things he did is he looked at that photograph and goes, he looked me in the eye and goes, your people killed my people.
European descendants benefit from a violent history of land grabbing and genocide that was justified by patriotism and religion. This same theology formed an international legal structure that continues to dispossess indigenous peoples of their lands. What does it mean to be a peacemaker today in a world where the present is defined by the violence of the past?
My grandfather, who I spent a lot of time with, and at one point he took me up to a place west of here, an area in the Tite, and he said, yeah, we brought about 1,500 head of cattle in here and we're gonna let them rest. But then he walked to the edge of the meadow and he pointed to some trees and he said, and we found two Indians hanging from that tree. And I could tell, you know, it was serious. And I asked them why, you know. I mean, in a lot of the Western lore, we have cowboys and Indians fighting it out, but the reality of this coming from my grandfather pointing to the tree where it happened was a little shocking. And he said, well, you know, we're taking their land and they want it back.
In the simplest terms, the doctrine of discovery is the idea under international law that when a European Christian country was the first European to discover new lands, they had a legal right to that area.
The doctrine of discovery defined anybody who is not Christian as less than human and unworthy of land ownership.
The doctrine of discovery as practiced is evil. It provided that only those who know Christ are to be the chosen people. And it indicated that those who did not know Christ, who were not baptized, were heathens and had no souls and were animals. As a result of that, those heathens and animals could not own, possess, manage, or use their own indigenous lands.
There is no question that religion was a major part of the doctrine of discovery and justification from the European viewpoint as to why they were predominant and dominant, and God intended for European Christians to have the whole world. And in the famous or infamous papal bulls in 1452 and in 1455, the Pope orders Portugal to invade, subdue the Saracen and which was their word for Muslim, and the pagan of any of whatsoever, take their property, take their lives, govern them, rule them. Hey, the popes created these papal bulls and started this development of the doctrine of discovery. But this was not a Catholic Church specific movement. The idea of acquiring the lands and rights of indigenous peoples was very much just a European idea, and maybe greed. Let's say the word outright. Queen Elizabeth I is the best example. She was an excommunicated Catholic. She authorized English expeditions to North America to attempt the first English colonies in North America. She complied with the papal bulls, even though she was no longer Catholic. And so she ordered Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who were the first Englishmen authorized by the crown to attempt colonies in what's now the United States. And I can quote you the phrase, she told them, go where no Christian prince has yet been, and acquire for me sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title.
And so the race was on for European monarchs to discover and claim as much of the New World as possible in the name of Christ.
Terra nullius is also an aspect of the doctrine of discovery, and there's two aspects of terra nullius. If land was completely empty and no human lives there, when a European power arrived there, they claimed it.
But that wasn't the case when Columbus landed in what is now San Salvador. We were estimated in North and South America, 95 million natives. When the era of extermination by the United States of native peoples ended, we were less than 1 million people. And what happened to all of our ancestors who had a right to live here? Their rights should not have been subjugated by the doctrine of discovery.
But Europeans were pretty intelligent, or should I say sneaky, about interpreting the doctrine of discovery in their own favor. So even if there were human beings where they landed, they still said this land is terra nullius if these people are not using the land in a way European legal systems approve. If they aren't farming, if they aren't using the land to the best and highest use, then that land is terra nullius and is vacant, quote unquote, and available for claim and acquisition by a European power.
In service to the state, the European settlers had a mandate to subdue and improve the land, to make it productive by European standards.
Productive land is considered land that was arable, that was farmed, that wasn't rocky and dry and hardpan. It's the kind of soil that can be built up over years and years of good farming practices. and Mennonites were known as good farmers. For centuries, they were developing these kinds of crop rotations, and the ways that they were doing agriculture built up soil. So they were often invited in by governments in countries that wanted land reclaimed.
When we fought our Revolutionary War with England and we signed that treaty in 1783, England granted the United States all its proprietary property rights in North America, south of Canada, and east of the Mississippi. Indian peoples went either to President Jefferson and to later leaders and said, we want to become US citizens. We want you to give us the fee simple titles to our lands because it's the only way to protect and keep our lands. The American politicians immediately started backpedaling. My own tribe, which was in Ohio in 1817, signed a treaty with the United States in which the treaty negotiators with our tribe made a mistake. And in the treaty, it said, you will have the fee simple title to your lands. And when that treaty went to the Senate, the US Senate refused to ratify it because they said, we're not going to give Indians and Indian tribes the fee simple or full ownership of their lands. And so our treaty was changed the next year in 1818 because the Congress refused to ratify that idea of giving us fee simple lands. The doctrine of discovery was brought into American law and jurisprudence in 1823 by our most famous Chief Justice, John Marshall. Of course, there was no Indian on either side, the plaintiff or the defendant. So it was non-Indians fighting over what used to be Indian land. The plaintiff, Mr. Johnson, his grandfather, had bought land directly from tribes that's now in the Illinois and Indiana area. Mr. McIntosh, however, had bought some of the same land from the United States, who had signed a treaty with those same tribes, and that's how the United States claimed to have acquired the land. And the United States Supreme Court said the tribes lost the ultimate title when Europeans showed up. They cannot
Hey, Deb, I think we can stop the video there.
sell their lands to the discovering European power. Even when American Indians became Christians, and
sorry.
even if they became civilized according to the definition of American society, it didn't really seem to change the American goal, which was to acquire all the assets.
I can't get back. Hold on one sec.
Congressional Act of 1830, the Indian Removal.
It's not
Act,
letting me
passed by Congress and signed by President Andrew Jackson.
If you mute your microphone, will that work, Deb? Okay, poor Deb. Oh my goodness, she's helping us here and she got a little stuck there. Okay, well, we're good now. So, okay, we're back. And that was a lot to process, right? A lot of dates, a lot of history, a lot of things happening. But what we can see is, like we discussed, that what drives colonization are things like expansion of wealth, control of economic resources, power and greed, capitalism and patriarchy. And so the question now is, based on what we saw, how do you think colonizers justified engaging in this process? Like, what reasons might colonizers give about occupying or accumulating and dispossessing other people of their lands? And what do you think they what did they think about how to make this okay and logical in their minds? I'd love to hear from some of you in the chat. Yeah, definitely religion, right?
As peoples.
Okay, so
including
what
decimating
slide
the
are we
buffalo
supposed to be on,
population and other
Morgan?
food
Sorry.
sources, coercing them onto reservations and compelling them
Can
to
you hear me?
dominate dominant
Yeah,
culture.
we're on slide 12, Debbie. Yep, religious and racial superiority, right? And those are connected. Yep, absolutely. Yes, thank you for saying that, Becky. So this use of this sort of ideology, right? Well, Native American people they're not really using the land to its fullest benefit, right? But exactly, hiding behind Christianity and religious values to justify this expansion, right? So sometimes people will bring up the concept of policy like manifest destiny, right? So these decisions are being made because they're part of God's will. Like the land is there, like we heard in the video. Like it's there, it's available, right? Because who's living on all of this? And the belief that people who lived on the land prior to colonization are inferior, and part of this is due to racism, right? The color of their skin and the practices and cultures, that these things are different, that they are not the same as Christian beliefs and values, and that those differences then challenge the values and beliefs of the oppressors. So then we see the use of this sort of complex of superiority, right, and power. And the colonizer believes that they know better how to live, and that it is perhaps even their job, and they make it their mission to civilize what they consider to be uncivilized nations and people, right? They're saving people from their ways all across the continent, and we know that and countries and various different places, we know that this still happens. Personally, in my tribe, we had Spanish missions that were created up and down the state, of California, and so I know that like there were ancestors and folks that were enslaved to build those structures. And this might look different in each community, but the colonization exists, right, for each of us. And we've carried that with us through the generations, that impact that it has caused to our ways of life. Also, thinking about sort of the ways that colonizers dehumanize other cultures, right? What those practices look like to promote that white supremacy, the belief that white is the best. There's a colorism aspect to this, but promoting a set of beliefs that are really consistent and, like we said, sort of tied to political, social, religious structures that reinforce those beliefs and values. And the settler colonials wanted that land and resources to accumulate capital. And by taking that land, they could thrive at our expense, while also in the process working to assimilate or extinguish in some ways our culture and values, and also the people who lived here, right? And this sort of concept later on of establishing citizenship and belonging was used to sort of place value on certain people lives, and to create kind of a ruling class in that regard. And I think that it's been shared before in other spaces that there's this sort of contrast, right, between what folks might say are their sort of like Christian values compared to what do they actually do, and like what are people sort of willing to do to like look at that, right, that impact, and to say, oh, we're helping others, but really that's not the case. Like, why are these things misaligned? And we can see that in the different policies and practices that our government has established over time. So there's really a connection here that's sort of embedded, right? Like historical trauma, colonization, and violence against Native people. Like this process started on our land. So we're going to look at the tactics and methods that colonizers or oppressors use to justify exploitation. Abby, do you want to go to the next slide? Okay. So again, we talked a little bit about manifest destiny, right? But papal bulls, resource extraction, and like we already mentioned, assuming that other religions are bad. Oh no, like this isn't, this is not what we think that religion is intended to be. Like this is paganistic, or they're these worship, the way that people worship or their practices are not consistent with this ideology that we subscribe to. So we're going to persecute this. Sacredness and interconnection to all of creation, right, is sort of conditioned out. And there's a belief that no, like, well, men are the heads of the households, like we know that there are tribes that were matrilineal. So this is direct, comparison in terms of how things are structured, right? Where did that come from? That's part of that patriarchy that they're trying to condition in. Loss of land, right, led to loss of identity, purpose. Where would we hunt? Where would we fish? Who would we gather medicines or foods for sustenance, sacred herbs? And rape was weaponized as a tool, right, to control women's and other people's bodies, not just during war, but also as a means of genocide. And like we already talked about, when matriarchy was sort of dismantled, then we see things, right, like values such as homophobia, sexism, misogyny, and again, uplifting the values of the patriarchy are then sort of instilled. Next slide, Debbie. So what do we mean by appropriating, sort of appropriating money? We have that on this slide, right? We're looking at here specifically like the middle of the slide, but also we have the Indian Civilization Act, 1819 to 1840s, where we're talking about Congress appropriating $10,000 to civilize. Again, the belief that Indians, as they termed us, not a name that we gave ourselves, are heathens, and we need to be civilized. So we need to have our names changed to something, the Christian name. Our hair is cut, right? Our practices, we were told we can't practice any longer, all cultural practices. So laws are passed that provide funding for certain activities as dictated by the values of our government to achieve certain goals. And so in this way, we're really talking about assimilation. And Congress has provided a budget in several of these situations listed on this slide. And these are policies that were purposefully enacted. So I'm wondering, when you all think of assimilation, this is a process, but when you hear that word assimilate, what does that mean? Like, what does that sort of conjure up for you? Like when you're thinking about what that is? Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you, Kiki. Erasure. Yep. Being white. Mm-hmm. Yep. Conformity. Absolutely. Yeah. Melting into the mainstream. Destruction. Hierarchy. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Trying to fit in programming. Right. And by assimilation too, right? We don't mean that this was a practice that was sort of enacted with any of our feedback, right? It was something that the government decided. So this was enacted on our behalf, although not with our sort of voices in mind, right? We weren't asked if we wanted to assimilate. So we see again, we have in 1830, the Indian Removal Act. So relocation, right? Moving tribes west of the Mississippi. And this is also sort of coinciding with what we talked about with Manifest Destiny and the reasons for that. We see the Trail of Tears, right? Money is being given to the military to have them go into tribal villages and communities and forcibly remove the folks who lived there off of the land. Because that land is going to be sort of, redistributed, so to speak, as a resource to others, to, like we saw in the video, to basically come in and work that land the way the government saw fit, the way that they believed it should be lived on and utilized, and also to extract the resources that were there. So we couldn't practice our cultural traditions, couldn't gather, couldn't not speak our languages when we were removed, right? Then we see things happen after assimilation policies. We're looking at boarding school, right? So, this is like just looking at this for a second, 1881 to 1901, Congress appropriates $3,080,367 in boarding school contracts. A lot of money, especially given the time period, right? So dozens of boarding schools are erected. Sort of the policy of the government is kill the Indian, save the man, right? It's one of our most harmful institutions. Children are taken from their families. It's a trauma and a legacy of trauma that we carry, many of us that have had that happen within our families. And those impacts have been long lasting, right? Being stripped of our culture, our traditional ways of being, our medicines. And this was purposely done, right? And there was a lot of different forms of abuse that occurred in those spaces. And really, it's a testament to the fact that assimilation went hand in hand with violence often, especially when we saw the militarization of relocation, but generations of people, right, who are growing up without our traditional teachings, without those identities. And so they're being forced to adopt white man's culture, right, and values and beliefs. And then that's what we're seeing, those impacts, those long-lasting impacts now today that we're trying to decolonize. So I'm wondering, what are some of our spiritual and cultural practices that we have that are, you know, part of who we are as Native people today? And what are some of the things that we value as Native people? Family, yeah, community. Band, the drum. Yep, relationships and our resources, culture, nature, ancestors and spirit. Yep. Traditions. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Our connections to earth and ceremonies, our cultural resources, languages, prayer. Thank you. Yes. Our histories, right? And reciprocity, perhaps. And so, you know, even more currently, we've seen policies, right? Adoption policies, ICWA, sterilization policies. So again, continued control over women's and other folks' reproductive rights. Continue to see that even, right? In some ways with different policies and that have been overturned, or also things like the Hyde Amendment that impact access for folks who are seeking certain services. From the 1970s to today, right? Voter suppression. And for the majority of communities, there's an inability, right, to really sort of have jurisdiction over non-native offenders, right, who are causing harm. Even though there have been changes to VAWA, those changes can only be enacted if you meet certain criteria in terms of prosecution and that jurisdiction. And not every community has the funding available or the infrastructure to support being able to employ those strategies, which means that there isn't any jurisdiction there for non-native offenders, that justice is impacted by that. Yes, and thank you, storytelling and oral traditions. Yes. Okay, so Debbie, are we on the next slide now? We're on, and we should be on 15. Are we good? Yeah, a couple more. Yeah, there we go. Thanks, Debbie. So if we are moved off the places where our resources are, where our ancestors lived, do we have access to what we need to survive, right? Looking at the impact, do we have access to medicines that treat our illnesses? Do we have access to the foods that we need to be healthy, to thrive? Again, where will we hunt? What will we eat? You know, I was at the Smithsonian some weeks ago, a couple weeks back, and I just sat there looking at the ration tickets for an unbelievably long period of time because I thought this is what replaced our traditional foods, right? Like we're being given ration tickets by the government, and what could we possibly purchase with that? Flour, right? Different things that were not traditionally what we had consumed, and how has that impacted us, right? Like different rates of obesity and other health issues that we have. And so it carries on till today, this impact, but the destruction of those cultural traditions and practices and the removal of the natural resources, not having access to sacred or ceremonial sites, the burial rituals, the land-based medicines again, and the original forms of accountability and justice, right, that we would seek should there be folks who cause harms within the community. And again, of course, the destruction of social structures. So family, our kinship ties, our governments, right, our traditional forms of government, our traditional economies like trading. And I mean, they're powerful teachings here, right, in ways that we were in community with one another, where we took care of each other, where we were, and now, you know, there's sort of this creation of a scarcity of resources mentality, right, where we're meant to be in competition with one another based on these capitalistic endeavors. And how did this impact our communities and traditional ways of being, the ways that of life that we had and held with us for so long were interrupted by the colonizers. And so just something to sit with. But when we think about this impact, the question is, how do we decolonize and get some of these things back? How do we reclaim, right? All right, next slide, Deb. Thank you. And so there's a continuation, right? Like a continuum, sorry, of assimilation, but also assimilation continues. It definitely hasn't stopped. So we see here on the slide that, you know, there's sort of a spectrum, right? But no cultural adaptation means that we managed to maintain traditional patterns that include our language, communication, the ways that we think and believe, values, spiritual beliefs and practices, you know, traditional family structures. And then the other side of that, right, is complete assimilation, which is what the government would like to see happen, right? So we lose all of our traditional ways of being, and we adapt to the thinking and the patterns and values and the religious and other types of structures of the majority of the colonizers. And we sort of embed ourselves in these hierarchies with the communication patterns and accept the dominant culture and allow that to take a precedence. However, given that, you know, I think it's an interesting concept to sort of think about this as a continuum, because when we sort of ask the question of how do we get sort of decolonize and get to a space where we feel that we can reclaim our culture, I wonder how much of that too, right, that what do we go all the way to no cultural adaptation, or do you guys think that there's sort of a space here where, like technology, for example, are we going to let go of our phones? Are we going to live like pre-contact? Like, is that something that is feasible for us? And how do we sort of maintain or find balance in the practices, but also acknowledging that, you know, we are disrupting systems that are quite large, but also whose goal is to have us assimilate, right? and eventually perhaps not exist. So I'm sort of interested in thinking a little bit more about that if anyone has something they want to share. But like where is this balance? Like how do we get there in this space together? And also the work that we do as advocates, like how do we recognize the need for incorporating, right, our cultural practices and ways of being and healing into the services that we provide, knowing that those things have been forcibly removed, and where are we all at with that? You want to go to the next slide, Deb? So there's really no one person, right, that has all the solutions or the gifts or the knowledge that we need to sort of answer these really important questions. But it is something imperative to consider who are the cultural practitioners in your community and who you have access to that can help, right, to sort of strengthen and fortify like cultural teaching, like who are the knowledge keepers, and that you feel are comfortable and safe to work with. And if you don't know, like where do we start? How can we do this work? Where do we build? And for non-Native folks, can you identify and do you know someone in your community that you can work with, that you can collaborate with, that you can be in community with, where you can access that knowledge and also create a shared space? And it's important for us to listen and be grounded, right, in the community and the perspective, but also there's a component of education. So, assessing where the community's at and also what the needs are and what people know about the work that we're doing, and how do we build off of that rather than make assumptions, and following our intuition. So that inner voice that we all have, that gut instinct that we tell people to rely upon, like that we have to also honor and respect and rely upon that for ourselves. Debbie, thank you. Okay, so now we're going to get into the pillars of oppression, which I think are, if we want to stretch for a second, we're getting in deep here, so we might need a few seconds of stretching. So I'm just gonna do a quick stretch here. If anyone else wants to join me, that'd be great too. This is an interactive part of the presentation. So be asking a bunch of questions, and you guys can come off of mute if you want to respond. All right, so how is oppression held in place? All right, next slide.
And that is
So we see here that oppression uses violence without any consequences, that it's used to control oppressed groups by splitting them right into collaborators and resistors, or good and bad groups or individuals. It promotes a belief in the superiority of the oppressors and makes the oppressed into inferior objects, and also teaches submission to the oppressed. And we'll acknowledge that there's probably many more that we could discuss, but these are the ones that we're going to focus on for today. All right, so instead of doing breakouts, we're going to all be together. And again, if you want to come off mute and unmute yourself or type in the chat, either is great and would be appreciated. So the first question, what are examples of using violence without consequences? Mm-hmm. Yep, thank you for that. Janie says police. Yep. Lori says established cycles, right? Military. Mm-hmm. Okay, yep. Religious abuse, keyboard ninjas, okay. What, anyone else have anything? Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Parent to child or child abuse not reported. the legal system. Yeah, politicians and media persons, right, with great wealth and influence. And that's a really good point too, Brenda, right? Like, what is put out in the media, and you know, failure to sort of highlight and demonstrate issues that are you know, particularly related to Native folks. And I think that that's been the lack of media coverage and the way that we're portrayed has been an issue for quite some time. So thank you for that. Yeah, jurisdictional disorganization. Violence could be forcing a family to move from their home. Yeah, relocation, still a reality. Yeah. Gaslighting and psychological manipulation, racism in medical care. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Yep. Emotional abuse, economic abuse. Yep. Sexual abuse. Yeah, as most time there's no consequences for the perpetrators. Bullying. Sports heroes from high school to pro ball. Yep. Powerful people. Microaggressions. Yes. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. So that's one of the things I have on here too, is that, you know, using violence without any consequences. This means that somebody can do something to hurt someone, right? Without any having to sort of be accountable for that, without anyone saying anything. And sometimes there's subtleties, but oftentimes there's not. It's like, okay, somebody did this thing and it was intentional. People who are in positions of power, right, leveraging that power, exploiting others, and those microaggressions too. Yep. Mothers who report abusers, yeah, will lose custody of children. Yeah, so that's like why someone might not, right? Like that fear. Exactly. Excessive consequences imposed American Indians and judicial systems. Yep, absolutely. Mass incarceration of Black and brown bodies. Yes, thank you for that. You guys are amazing. Thank you for all of these. These are great. I know we're going to share the chat out too, so thank you. It was wonderful. Lateral violence, manipulation, stalking. Yep, convincing the victim they're being dramatic. Yeah, so there's like a theme here, right? All of the ways that we're seeing that, you know, folks go without having to face any accountability for their actions. Yep, absolutely. Debbie, do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. So now we're looking at the second pillar, right? Controls oppressed groups by splitting them into good and bad, collaborators and resistors. And I don't know about the rest of you, but the use of the words good and bad, I mean, that's oppressive by itself. What does that even mean? Like, who's defining what's good and what's bad? But how do we do this? How do we split people into these groups of collaborators or resistors? Like, what does this look like? What might those groups be? Like, do we have any examples of that? Incarceration. Yep, absolutely. Thank you for that, Emily. Yeah, nonprofit grant funding. Yep, sure. Who's deserving, right? Who's worthy? Who's met the criteria, jumped through the hoops, done all the things. Model minority tropes. Yep, absolutely. Yep, race or sex. And Steph says society has painted a picture of the perfect victim, and someone who doesn't report or take sane is a bad victim. Yes. Yep. Politics. Civil disobedience versus regular resistance. Yeah. Yes. Thank you for sharing that too. Abuse dynamics, right? With multiple people, children. So, I mean, that makes me sort of think about credibility, and the ways that we sort of hear people talk or speak about survivors or victims, right? Like, well, why didn't you leave? Well, look at how they look or where they live or how this and these other things, right? Sort of reducing people to their circumstances in life, and using that as a way to put people into good and bad groups. That could be any way, right? Like, well, this person uses substances. So, well, that's bad, right? Like versus somebody who doesn't, okay, that's the person we're gonna put our, time and energy into. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Mental health. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, next slide, Deb. So the third pillar is promotes belief in the superiority of the oppressors, right? So we talked about those hierarchies and inferior versus superior, that language. So how do we promote belief in the superiority of the oppressor? I think the first question is, who is the oppressor, right? So this could be anybody employing oppressive tactics or using oppressive tactics. And as advocates, can they be oppressors? Like when you think about who promotes these beliefs, yeah, exactly, absolutely, right. Anyone that serves as a gatekeeper, right, to services or anything that helps meet someone's needs, absolutely could become be oppressive to other folks, depending on, again, the belief in who's good and who's bad, who's deserving or undeserving, right? And so I think that there's, just something about this pillar is that sort of reflective process, right? Like, how are we acting as gatekeepers? What's our role and responsibility? How do we check conscious and unconscious bias in our work? Yeah, thank you. Systems of religion, absolutely. Yep, imposing a value system that's not our own, right? That promotes that superiority. Yeah. Poverty, porn, media pieces portraying our communities needing a white savior. And advocates can become oppressors when we feel that we should be the one to decide who gets services. Yeah, absolutely. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. And okay, so this next pillar, we're looking at make the oppressed into inferior objects, right? So objectification. And why might this happen? Because when people are objects and they're commodities, we don't have to care about how they feel, right? Plain and simple. Like if somebody's a thing, then they're not a person, then we're not attaching an emotion and we don't have to value the thoughts, the feelings. And there's sort of a distance that gets created, right? Between perhaps our actions or our thoughts about these people or how, inferior objects, and our level of accountability goes back to that first pillar, right? Like, what can I get away with? And so folks who cause harm, right? There might not be those consequences that we were talking about, and it's opportunistic. So how do we make oppressed people into inferior objects? Like, what are ways that we objectify people? Yes, thank you, Afton. Homogenizing survivors of communities of culture, referring to survivors as singular beings. Yeah. Infantilizing. Thank you, Jamie. Dependent on the economy and material items, people act like the more they have of material things, the better they are. Yep. By always highlighting their trauma and not their healing. Yeah, thank you so much, Tara. Using them as team mascots. Yep. Absolutely, Becky. Yeah, thank you. So inferiority is part of impression, right? Because it gives superior groups more power and control. And the federal policies that have been enacted have oppressed us and turned us into objects, right? This forced conformity. And we sort of see this also, like the way that that's reinforced is by sort of the doling out of consequences and punishments for certain groups, like what you guys had already talked about, right? Like we're talking about mass incarceration, that these threats of punishment, right? And consequences that are used to control us, our bodies, rather than those who do cause harm. Okay, next slide. Got one more pillar. We're doing great. Okay, so this pillar, right, teaches submission to the oppressed. So the question here is sort of, how do we intentionally or accidentally teach submission to oppressed people? And I'd love to hear what you guys think about that. I have like a couple things written down here, but do not have all of the knowledge. So this is why these spaces are so important for us, right? That co-learning and co-creation of knowledge. Yes, thank you. Time and placing when victims come forward. Yeah. Yep, not compensating survivors when they help support our services. Yeah, ask them to tell their story over and over again. Exactly. I was thinking of that too, Jennifer, right? Like rewards for the good or bad behaviors, right? Approved. Yeah, absolutely, right? And even to some degree, I think we see tokenism. Like, here's the example of what somebody should look like or think like or be like, right? And yeah, thank you, Candace. The welfare system, if you don't jump through the hoops, you're cut off. Yep, absolutely. Okay, next slide, Deb. Thank you all so much for your engagement in that. So the pillars, right, they uphold it all. They're upholding oppression. There they are. And our role, right, is to interrupt these institutional practices. And once we recognize and acknowledge this oppression, it's really hard to turn away from it. It's really hard to do nothing. And it's all around us on conscious and unconscious levels. We see it everywhere. So, you know, when we talk about sort of the ways that we can interrupt the institutional structures, we're talking about political, financial, social, and spiritual, right? All of the things. Deb, you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. All right, so to make up on time, because we had such a good, rich conversation, we're going to move through these slides. If there's any questions or anything at the end, that's fine too. But so advocacy for change, right? So thinking about advocacy with and for individuals targeted for sexual violence and how to change these systems, right, to respond to the needs of victims of sexual violence. That includes changing local, state, and federal policies and practices and changing social norms. And so we have to think about what are our policies, what and how do we go about modifying these? What are the social norms in our communities? How are we identifying those? Making sure that we're staying, you know, community and survivor centered. And what does it look like when we know the perpetrator? And there's a potential that, you know, there could be retaliation, there could be, we could be targeted, right? Like doing the work and sort of how do we sort of balance that and how do we change, you know, those systems and structures that are in place so that we can really advocate on all of these levels for the needs of the survivors and victims. Next slide, Deb. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to sort of look at advocacy for change throughout time. So in the 70s, we're starting here with the First Native Women's Coalition, American Indian Women's Circle Against Abuse, and 1978, right? It wasn't until 1978 that we were legally allowed to practice ceremonies again. Even things like bright burning sage, participating in ceremony with the Indian Religious Freedom Act. And also that same year, ICWA, right? So it was passed where then Native children were legally required by law to be placed with family members, sometimes referred to, right, kinship care, or members of their community when possible. And then in the 1980s, we see the King Gleska Pine Ridge Reservation Intervention Project. So the first reservation to pass pro-arrest codes for domestic violence. And then the Women of Nations Eagle's Nest, first urban native shelter. And Mending the Sacred Hoop Intervention Project. So this later became a national technical assistance project. You can see all of these transitional things that are happening through the 80s, right, that are going to lead us up next to the 90s. I'm going to go to the next slide, Deb. Thanks. And that's where we see things like the passage of Violence Against Women Act in 1994. President Biden and others actually helped to write this legislation. and money was appropriated towards this act to address domestic violence, sexual violence, dating violence, right, stalking. And so we know that advocates have to apply to get that money through grants to do their work, the work that is so imperative and important that you all do. You know, shelters, services, medical, legal, all of that. And in 1998, we saw the Sacred Circle National Resource Center, and also the Office of Victims of Crime provided direct funding to tribes. We also see STOP programs, right? Stop Violence Against Women grant program, and the Office of Justice Programs mandated to work on government to government basis with tribes. So we're seeing evidence that millions of dollars, right, are being poured into helping our programs to end violence against women and men and children. And then in the 2000s, we have the first tribal coalitions were formed, right? So Oklahoma, we got the first domestic violence coalition, and in Minnesota, the first sexual assault coalition. And then Clan Star, so technical assistance provider to the tribal coalitions. And then we also have the first tribal consultation in 2006. And we see the, we have NIWRC, National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, and NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians here, right? So tribal programs where Native survivors can go and access services that are curtailed to support their needs specifically. And then again, we have the Violence Against Women Act. So we're adding Title IV here. We have more policy and legislation to end violence against Native women. We have a task force, again, through NCAI, and we have funding being provided to 28 tribal coalitions. In 2006, we have the Office of Violence Against Women Tribal Unit established, so TAD. And then we have the Tribal Law and Order Act that's passed in 2010. And these are really important bodies of legislation. In addition, we don't have it on here, but we also have things like the Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction, right, that's passed recently, not too recently, but recently enough, which is sort of an add-on to VAWA, where we see that tribes are able to prosecute specific crimes related to domestic violence and also sexual violence down and trafficking. Whether or not, I think we mentioned a little bit earlier, folks have the capacity to do that in the community based on the structures for the courts and prosecution and all of that. It really sort of depends. But that is also something that we've seen happening in terms of advocating for change at the federal level. And then finally, we have sexual assault realities, right? And what we've talked about today, which is that the cause is rooted in oppression. It's related to historical trauma, and you know that oppression has impacted us in ways that we are continuing to heal from. We have harm doers and offenders, and these are the folks that are responsible, not the victims and the survivors. And while other practitioners do not condone sexual violence or sexual assault, they're doing their own work, right? They're governed by different responsibilities, laws, duties, beliefs, and some of those are not necessarily aligned with the work that we're doing. And sometimes those responses are not always helpful. Oh, I think we're being asked to go back one slide if we can, Deb, for just a minute. Oh, okay, so, all right, are we good? Is this okay, this slide? Okay, that's the one I'm on to. And sexual assault advocates, right? Thank you, standing outside the systems, but also the ones advocating for the change, right? I mean, the voices are important because you know the work, you know the communities, you know the needs of the survivors and the victims. And really working together to challenge those political structures like that perpetuate and support sexual violence. And how do we work within those structures? Because we know that they're going to continue to exist. But how do we come together in solidarity to work within those structures in order to make that change, right? How do we disrupt those structures? That's sort of the question. I think that's been ruminating throughout this conversation. And we know that sexual violence has been an effective tool for power and control. So how do we heal and reclaim our culture and all the things, right? While also acknowledging that these realities exist in our communities, and that they are embedded sometimes, and that we have to do the work to educate and to share space and to have these conversations that are really important. And okay, next slide, Deb. So now we're coming down to the last two slides here. So we're talking about strengthening our sovereignty, right? Means that we have the right to write codes and laws and determine how to modify policies, protocols, and access justice. So that's done through our tribal courts and justice systems, our tribal social service programs, our tribal advocacy programs, government to government consultations, and through that public policy change that we talked about. And lastly, but also the biggest piece of all, right, is that advocates are bridge builders, that we're strengthening the community, getting back to a place where we restore and uplift our cultural practices. So, you know, looking at decolonizing these social structures, but nobody has access to all of these things, right? That we each hold a piece of the knowledge, and that we have to come together in community and ground ourselves in community to establish these connections, so that we can support this work by incorporating our Indigenous values and creating space that shares this knowledge. It strengthens us, it fortifies us, it brings us together, but it also, what we teach and share, we would be passing down to future generations to come. And so although all of our practices might be different, just honoring, respecting, and valuing everybody's contributions and unique gifts. And I think that's what we have. Are we over, Steph? We need a break, right?
Do you want to watch part of that video? We have that video, but we can.
Yeah, we have this slide. I wanted to make sure that was okay. So it's up to you if you want to do the video, or if you feel like I wasn't sure where you wanted to break at.
You can show it, and then yeah, it's still fine, I think.
Is that okay? Okay. All right, Deb has the second video. If you will please share that, Deb. Is it working okay, Deb? Do you need me to try to do something?
Can you see it?
Oh,
you can see it? You can't see it?
Oh, yeah. Rise up, all
Okay.
you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I can feel it in my heart. Can you feel it in your blood? I can hear the seven fire calling us to wake up, wake up. All nations rise, rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide
No?
anymore, 'cause now's the time.
Yep, you're good.
Nations rise, rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide anymore, 'cause now's the time. With forgiveness as my bow and my prayers as my arrows, pull them back and let go. I watch them fly like sparrows. Have hope. Yeah, have hope. With compassion as my shield and faith down to my marrow, I will walk the pollen path even when it gets narrow. Yeah, yeah, I resurrect. Yes, you can bet that we seen the single mama raising children on the res. We seen domestic violence tear apart what we have left. We seen the alcohol take it all and leave us dead. We seen the children take their lives when they can't take the dread anymore. Can't take the dread anymore. No, we can't take the dread anymore. No, we can't take the dread anymore. Yeah. It's a war, but we've seen it all before. And now we know we can change it, 'cause that's why we were born. We know we are the ones that we have been waiting for. We are the ones Grandma has been praying for. So rise up, all you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I can feel it in my heart. Can you feel it in your blood? I can hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up. Wake up. Pueblo hermoso, levántense, es nuestro tiempo. No tienes que esconderte más. Ahora es nuestro tiempo. Mujer indígena, tú eres tan sagrada. Traigas medicina de tu suelo todavía. A pesar del abuso de tu cuerpo y tu tierra, respetamos tus ancestros y la suya cultura. Hombre indígena, tú eres honorable y yo veo la fuerza que todavía sobrevive. A pesar del abuso de tu raza venerable, yo respeto tus ritos, tus danzas, tus padres. Somos guerreros del amor y guerreros de la paz. Sí, no vamos a escondernos más. Somos guerreros del amor y guerreros de la paz. Sí, no vamos a escondernos más. All nations
They say that history is
rise,
written by the victors.
rise up, 'cause
But how can
now
there be a
we
victor when the war
we
isn't
don't
over?
have to
The battle
hide
has only just begun,
anymore,
and Creator
'cause
is
now
sending
the time
his very best warriors. And this time, it isn't Indians versus cowboys. No, this time, it is all the beautiful races of humanity together on the same side, and we are fighting to replace our fear with love. And this time, bullets, arrows, and cannonballs won't save us. The only weapons that are useful in this battle are the weapons of truth, faith, and compassion.
Thank you, Morgan and Deb and Shayla. We are going to take a quick 15-minute break. Take some time, get what you need to get done. I'm going to let my dog out, and we'll see you guys back in 15. Thank you.
not commit the sin of fraud, but.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you're able to take a little time, a breather. That was a lot of information, but done so well by Morgan. Thank you so much. I appreciate you and the way you communicate. I just appreciate you. I'm going to hand it over to Shayla, who's going to talk about sex offenders and what advocates need to know. And thank you.
Thank you, Steph. Hey, everybody. I hope you had a good break, got some coffee, got some water, smudge. Hopefully my dog is not bad during our during our webinar. Okay. So I'll be covering sex offenders and what advocates need to know. So the goal of this section, sorry, the face screens in the Zoom keep like getting in the way of my PowerPoint, and I'm like trying not to. Okay. So the goal for this module is to provide basic information and characteristics of sex offenders, harm doers, as it relates to gender-based oppression, and explore what advocates need to know about sex offenders, sex offenses, and systems that are designed to protect the public that are put in place. Comprehend the basic state, federal, and tribal jurisdiction issues and the rules on the registration of sex offenders. Recognize a common model for treatment for sex offenders and understanding the goals and objectives of those treatments. Sorry, my taskbar and like the screen, the faces of Zoom keep getting in the way of my. And then recognize common tactics, how sex offenders use to target and groom victims. So stranger danger or not. So I really like this slide because it really educates on the misconception of not everyone knowing who your perpetrator is, which is false. Less than 20% of abusers are strangers, and most of the time the victim, the survivor, does know their perpetrator and is often related to the child. In the diagram below, you'll see the criminal justice funnel. And this is just painting the picture that most sexual predators are not caught, convicted, or imprisoned. A small amount of sex crimes are reported, 10%, and 27% of those 10% are reported and arrested. 54 to 70% of those are convicted. 65% of those convicted are given probation, and 35% of those are sentenced to prison. So really just keeping in mind, you know, we've talked about underreporting and people underreporting and how that, and just bringing that to life with statistics. So this is a reflection question. I would really love to hear from you all, whether you'd love to type your response in the chat, come off mute, but I would just love to hear from you all who are working as advocates, working as direct responders. What do you think? Do you think there are more sex offenses that are being reported? In the chat. I'm seeing yes in the chat. Thank you. Thank
Hey,
you.
Shayla, this is Becky. I was just going to speak to this question. I'm probably off camera, but the reporting, I think, is always so interesting. And specifically, I think about some of my work like on college campuses. I mean, this is, I think, relevant in any community, but lots of conversations like where you might see, you know, oh, well, we've had 0 sexual assaults reported here, or we've had, you know, 0, whatever. And, you know, I think that's some of the most alarming numbers, right? When you're working in a community or working in a place where there are 0 sexual assault reports, like we all know, just statistically, and as people doing this work, that sexual violence is happening. And so, you know, you just showed us even that 10% estimate on that last slide about what might be being reported. But it just, that's one of those things that just sticks out in my mind, is like when you are in a community or working with a community, whatever community means, and you see that zero number, that is really a time to be looking at your partners and your people and just thinking about like, what is going on, right? Like, and I know you're probably getting into this going here, but like, you know, what are the barriers that are in place that are, you know, discouraging people or prohibiting people from making those reports? Because if we're seeing like zero, we know that's a problem. So that's what that kind of question always makes me think of. So thank you.
Thank you so much for all of that, Becky. And thank you for leading us into this next question and how we talked about underreporting and 10%, and you know, how Becky said, well, about the policies of none being reported. So just from speaking from your community, why do you think victims don't tell someone or report the crime to police? Victim blaming. Yeah, thank you. Shame, guilt. Yep. Family dynamics. Thank you. Right. In rural and tight-knit communities where everyone knows each other. Thank you. And so for our next question, in your community, speaking to that, who are the suspected sex offenders in your community? Family, thank you. Anybody? Hi, Listina. Knowledge keepers, thank you. Community members. Religious leaders, spiritual leaders. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, those are great answers. And especially like in community and thinking about just rural and urban communities, and you know, are we talking about it? Is it a safe space to talk about? You know, sexual violence is a tough topic, and to talk about public safety in your communities. Thank you all. I am sorry, the Zoom keeps getting in the way of my PowerPoint. Okay. So not all child molesters are pedophiles. I know we talked a lot, or I know we touched a little bit about this in Morgan's presentation. So a child molester, a person who touches a child for their own sexual gratification, they do not legally become a child molester until they have victimized a child. For pedophilia, they are sexually attracted to prepubescent children. And pedophilia is a psychiatric diagnosis, not a legal term, and you can have a diagnosis without victimizing a child or committing a crime against a child. Talking about perpetrators and harm doers of crime, youth do commit sex crimes. And I know some of these statistics may be a little bit outdated, but painting the picture of crimes committed, there were 2,200 arrests yearly for forcible rape, 9,200 arrests for other offenses. 20% of those offenders were under the age of 18. And the boys represented were more than 90% of the arrests made of sexual crimes were boys that were represented. And then talking about characteristics of juvenile offenders, you know, some of them have experienced physical and sexual abuse, 20 to 50% physical, 40 to 80% sexual abuse, have experienced sexual abuse, 30 to 60% have learning disabilities. And like we talked about that before, you know, some 80 to 90% have experienced profound victimization experience and do suffer from limited impulse control. If I'm talking too fast, just warn me and I'll slow down. Child sexual abuse does not predict future sexual aggression. Research has found on juveniles there's no compelling evidence that youth are likely to become adult sex offenders. Female victims turn into sexual predators at significantly lower rates. Some contributing factors to future aggression could be the age, number of incidents of abuse, time elapse, perceptions of how the family responded, maybe to their victimization, exposure to violence in the home, what is normalized, what is being taught in the home. Most rapists of Native women are non-Native men. According to U.S. Department of Justice statistics, Native American women and Alaska women are more than 2.5 times more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted than other women in the USA. In the U.S., in at least 86% of the reported cases of rape or sexual assault against Indigenous women and Alaska Native women, the survivors reported that the perpetrators were non-Native men. And then also just thinking about Indigenous women and how we experience 2.5 more violence. I was thinking of a trafficking statistic I read about how we represent less than 10% of the population, but more than 40 to 50% of trafficking victims. And we talk about underreporting a lot. So really seeing how that alarming statistic would look if reporting and numbers were accurate. Root causes of sexual violence against American Indian and Alaska Natives. Thank you for that video, Morgan, and talking about rape being a tool of colonization and conquest. Talking about how there was a long history of rape by settlers and soldiers, the violence experienced by Indigenous people, the forced Trail of Tears, forced marches, massacres. We had men, women, children, elders on those trails with no access to water, no access to food, no access to medical care or their medicines, smudge. So really thinking of how violence has shaped and has been used against us for colonialization, how those history and attitudes shape towards Indigenous people and how oppression and how that plays out today with discrimination, high rates of Indigenous women and boys, men, elders being targeted for violence, sexual violence. And then the broader societal norms that devalue women and children, people with disabilities. We talk about the different isms and classifying people, are they worthy of services, and how those bigger norms are brought into society against our two-spirit LGBTQ plus relatives. The social and political structures that support and perpetuate sexual violence against women of all backgrounds. We touched on like music and how that is violent, or like the social and political structures of violence against women, and just kind of how it's rooted in our culture that it is okay. Alcohol use is not the cause of sexual violence. So sexual impulses, one who already has those predisposed thoughts to commit sexual violence will act on those impulses, whether they've been drinking or not. And just like we talked about in the last slide, the root cause of sexual violence, oppression, and the historical treatment of tribal nations. We talked about sexism, the devalue of women, with colonization and a lot of our tribal and cultural teachings of a woman holding a high position. I don't want to say power, but like a high important position in our cultural societies before colonization. Women made strong decisions. They held a really strong place in our society. Women were warriors as well. They protect the home fire. Our women helped build teepees, went out on hunts. So a huge part of colonization really wiped out the Indigenous identity of that sexism, racism, classism. We talked about poverty and colonization, the lack of resources, you know, the forced marches taking us from our places that we once lived. And we talk about high rates of poverty and the discrimination that comes along with that. Colonialism, heterosexism, and homophobia. We talked about those social structures and, you know, heterosexism being pressured as the norm, the expectation of what to expect for sexual preference, ageism, ableism, discriminating against folks with physical disabilities, mental disabilities. Okay. So we'll go into talking about sex offenses and the state's efforts to enhance public safety and laws put in place, or policies, I'm sorry. So here are some of the I don't really want to say formulas, but a lot of tactics and a lot of behaviors that you do see from sex offenders and harm doers. A predator, you know, planning, strategizing, making sure that they have accessibility to the victim. If it's a child, attacking when there is no anyone around to protect the child, or if there's easy access to a person, attacking their credibility. Maybe it was at a party, was there alcohol involved, trying to make it sound like you didn't say no, are you sure? Gaslighting, co-occurrence, having it happen more than once because of the vulnerability, maybe because of the way they're strategizing, grooming a child or even grooming an adult, normalizing, saying that sexual violence is okay sexual behavior, abuse of the legal process. You know, predators are very smart and really understanding like the gaps in the legal process and how underreporting is a real thing, knowing that victims don't all the time do report. So really abusing the legal process, abusing the systems that are designed to keep us safe. And just like when we were going back to who are sex offenders, you know, like police, people we think who are there to protect the public, or people in power, spiritual leaders, people who know the legal process but yet abuse it because they see the gaps and they're able to know what to miss and stay undetected. Using violence as needed. Maybe the violence was a part maybe violence was a part of the assault, or using violence as retaliation in case if they do go report, or threatening with violence if they do want to tell somebody, or maybe even threatening their loved ones with violence. So sex offenses, there is a wide range of unwanted sexual activity, a sexual assault, or unwanted sexual contact, you know, touching, maybe there is no penetration, but not wanting to be touched or have another person have contact with you in that way. Prostitution, forced prostitution, preparatory offenses, using a minor in a sexual performance, offenses involving the production, distribution, or possession of pornography, threatening you or even attempting to commit an offense against you, non-consensual images or filming, taking pictures of you without your consent or even without you even knowing, filming you without knowing, using that as a threat against you. So the definition of a sex offender: someone who is convicted of a sex offense, someone who is convicted in state, tribal, or federal court, which do vary by state, tribal, and federal law. The word offender is used to refer to the person responsible for perpetuating forced, unwanted sexual activity without implying that an arrest has been made or charges issued. So according to Minnesota statutes, a predatory offender includes offenders convicted of sexually motivated crimes, predatory behavior that has criminal sexual conduct as their goal. And by Minnesota statutes, pattern predatory offender includes a serious offenders convicted of a serious sexual assault and determined to be dangerous to the public and in need of treatment. Sorry if I'm going fast. I just don't want to miss anything or get to the end. So degrees of criminal sexual conduct. Under Minnesota law, there are 5 degrees of conduct. The first is the most severe case, and 5 being the least serious offense. The considerations to determine the level of the charge is determined on the age of the perpetrator and the age of the victim, the nature of the perpetrator and the victim, the actual act or factual occurrence that is the basis for the sexual conduct being reported. And listed in this slide are the Minnesota state's 5 levels of criminal sexual conduct. The first degree, felony sexual penetration, and another condition such as use of a weapon, perpetrator is in a position of authority, age of the perpetrator and victim, causing physical injury. Second degree, felony, same as the first degree, but no penetration. Third degree, felony as well, penetration, and one of several other conditions such as force without inflicting injury, age of perpetrator, and the age of the victim. Fourth degree, same as the third, but no penetration. And the fifth degree is no felony charge for the the 5 levels of the criminal sexual conduct. And so this is just a question to ask you all. Please join in the chat or come off mute, whatever you feel more comfortable with. Why do you think it's so important for advocates to have an understanding of the degrees of criminal sexual conduct in your state? Steph, do you want to read what's in the chat? I'm sorry, I don't want.
Sure.
I can help too, Steph.
Okay.
Yeah. So folks are saying so that we can understand the statute of limitations and timing for reporting, to be able to help clients better, to explain things to survivors, and to inform survivors of their options, to accurately advocate for pursuit of justice, to assist client navigation of the judicial system, to inform and advocate for survivors, and to be able to work with law enforcement and get all the proper paperwork done for the victim, to be able to know how to support people through the legal process, as it can be extremely triggering and unsafe for Indigenous people, and to protect from a system designed for their oppression and advocate with eyes open. So it sounds like full transparency there. Yeah.
Thank you everyone for everyone chiming in. So this is the Minnesota sex offender registration. Sex offenders are required to register for a minimum of 10 years, but in most cases it is for life. The registration in Minnesota is called the predatory offender registration, and to register, they need to register if they are convicted of criminal sexual conduct, felony indecent exposure, kidnapping and false imprisonment, crimes involving using a minor in a sexual act, prostitution, or performance. The Minnesota public notification. So level 3 offenders, which are considered the most dangerous offenders, public notification is required. Offenders and have to be displayed on the predatory offender website. If the risk levels for reoffending determined by the Department of Correction levels 1 through 3. And if they do not comply with registration for more than 30 days, who do not comply with registration for more than 30 days appear on the offender website if they don't register. I'm sorry. Failing to register is an additional 5 years added to the registration period. For first-time convictions, the person might be subject to a prison sentence up to a year. Subsequent convictions for failure to register may result in minimum 2-year prison sentence, and any period of incarceration will result in the 10-year registration period starting over from the time they are released. The federal laws on sex offender management, SORNA. So the Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act, SORNA, is a federal law that was passed in 2006. It's unfunded, so with it being unfunded, it was unable to create a software, hire staff, and keep it updated. But the purpose of it was to provide a set of minimum standards for registration of sex offenders and for the community to stay notified. SORNA was the first federal sex offender law that affected tribes as well as states. Tribes that are impacted by SORNA, the PL 280 states that the Minnesota, the authority to regulate registration and notification on Indian reservation, so the PL 280. Red Lake and Bois Fort were excluded, but then they were required to opt in to SORNA and comply. Otherwise, Minnesota would have been given authority to regulate the registration and notification. The act required tribes, not PL 280 states, to opt into SORNA and agree to develop a system of registration and notification in compliance with the SORNA. So as of 2022, 186 jurisdictions are in compliance with SORNA, 22 states, 160 tribes, 4 territories. And here's a website to the implementation of the SORNA and to get more information. Okay. Assessment of risk. So for public safety, Minnesota requires an independent risk assessment of a sex offender. The Office of Sex Offender Sentencing, Monitoring, Apprehending, Registering, and Tracking. Sorry, this is the website to SORNA. And then risk factors for reoffending sexual offenders, having a deviant sexual preference, sexual preoccupation, compulsivity, sexualized violence, including sadistic sexual interests, and lack of a support system, which are all risk factors for reoffending. And then here are some more risk factors for reoffending sex offenders, which are taken into consideration when the assessment is taken into place. Poor coping skills, problem-solving skills, using sex as coping, an unstable lifestyle, not having self-regulation, criminal history, even including non-sexual, negative social influences, personality disorders, intimacy deficits, victim access, male-targeted pedophilia. And then there was a national study done most likely to reoffend. 52% who were more likely to reoffend were pedophiles who molest boys, rapists of adult women, child molesters, repeat offenders more likely than first-time offenders. So now getting into the treatment goals and treatment considerations for sex offenders is to, the huge goal of it is for them to take responsibility for behavior, understanding their patterns, their cycles and patterns of criminal behavior, learn relapse prevention and other skills to reduce the chance of reoffending, changing their attitudes and ways of thinking, acquiring skills and behavior so they could safely reside in a community. And self-control is another huge goal. And when considering them for treatment, are they amendable to treatment? Can they be safely reintegrated into a community, and how so? Not all sex offenders are treatable, and inadequate treatment is not better than no treatment at all. Treatment methods used. The most successful and common technique is cognitive behavioral group discussions led by a therapist using workbooks and assigning homework. Using a relapse prevention model to help cope with situations that may lead to offending. In Minnesota, the sex offender treatment program, clients have completed prison sentences, civilly committed by the courts, placed in treatment for intermediate time. A civil court may commit a person for sex offender treatment if a judge determines the offender has a psychopathic personality, is sexually dangerous, and that's for civil court if the judge determines for treatment. Okay. Let's take a few minutes to breathe, and I will take more breaths to slow down. I had all my windows open. No, I was lighting smudge and cedar and sweet pine. And then I had my heat going too. Then it got all smoky. I'm like, I better not have my smoke alarm going off. So I had to open the windows. Let the smudge out. Okay. We'll go into tactics used by sex offenders and what advocates need to know how sex offenders groom and target their victims. The undetected rapist, grooming of adult victims. We talked a lot about identifying their vulnerabilities. Are they lonely? Do they struggle with insecure? Are they non-assertive? Are they survivors already who already experienced any type of domestic or sexual violence? Planning attacks, we talked about that in the one slide, manipulation and planning. Using violence to control a situation, whether that's to follow through with the assault or keeping the victim quiet, controlling the victim. Using psychological weapons, manipulation, power and control, threats, drugs and alcohol. Maybe they're maybe someone's battling drug addiction and attacking that vulnerability and manipulating if there were drugs or alcohol around, manipulating and attacking their credibility. They didn't say no, they didn't are you sure that's what happened? Manipulating their memory and their ability to be credible in a court. Using marriage or intimate partner violence as an excuse to control our sexual gratification. We talk about that misconception that there can be no domestic violence in a marriage. The misconception that it isn't rape if you are married to them or in a relationship with them. So being aware of those manipulations and how they're used for harm. Isolating the victim, physical isolation, keeping them away from their family or friends, keeping them away from their support system, from resources. Manipulation, brainwashing is a real thing, and keeping them isolated could just keep them better under control or keeping them easier to control. And then even financial, I was thinking of financial abuse as well, too. Online predator tactics. Chatting privately, not showing your parents of who you're talking to, you know, all the different chat rooms, all the different types of social media, lying about age and lying about their age, using flattery and sympathy, building a trust building relationship, becoming good friends, making them think that they really care for you, pretending you're in a loving relationship, learning their victim, asking for personal information, learning their workplace, their community, where they live, where they go, learning their routine, learning who they're around, what kind of the dynamic of their family, using intimidation, blackmailing, fear, you know, using photos, threatening to get them in trouble. And I was even just thinking, you know, with it being like 2024, a lot of our work and a lot of our personal lives are done on our phones, and even just on our on the notes app on our phone, and how you could share that with somebody else, and they could be communicating that way as well on that note app on iPhones and on Androids. Targeting and recruitment of child victims. Working or living where children are accessible, where they're around children a lot. Targeting single mothers, less protection, thinking that the child of a single parent is more vulnerable. Identifies and targets weaknesses, looks at their life circumstances. Do they experience hunger? Do they not get a lot of financial means at home? Is the child left alone a lot, unsupervised? Identify what if the child does have needs, if they lack self-confidence, don't interact with a lot of people, seek attention for lack of it at home, they have prior physical and sexual abuse. Grooming of child victims, getting the child to know and love them. You know, we talked a lot about the child being related and knowing the perpetrator and the harm doer, convincing them that they're special, just like we talked about, using secrecy and isolation, testing the child, normalizing that behavior, saying that this is normal, this is love, this is normal behavior, it's not wrong. Progressing over time. Threatens to harm the child or the pets or the family, using bribes to keep quiet. Punishment, you know, maybe telling them like, you'll get in trouble if you tell your family, what's going to happen to me if you tell. Physical assault, using violence. And then taking them away from any type of support system to refrain them from getting help or talk about what is happening. I have a quick video, whoops, for online grooming. Steph, do we have time to watch the video?
I believe so.
Okay.
Um,
Sheila, I just wanted to mention too that it doesn't always have to be through Texas. It could be through PlayStation, Xbox, all those, your kids are in the room playing games. You have no idea who they're gaming with. You know, you don't know if they're exchanging numbers. They could be pretending they're a 13-year-old and really they're in their 40s. So games really brings in anybody into your child's life.
Thank you for that, Debbie. And you know, we've seen the trust building, we've seen him controlling in the ongoing of it, and how we could support, you know, support Becky and what she could do moving forward. Let me get the PowerPoint back up. Oh, let's take a few breaths, take a few. So now we could talk about implications for change and strengthening our communities, and how we talked about the social and the social norms. You know, reporting rates, how could we strengthen reporting and making victims feel more comfortable and making it more safety and accessible? Prosecution rates, you know, we talked about that, the funnel about the 10% being reported and then those being convicted, and the low percentages of those, I'm sorry, of reported sexual assaults. Documentation, collecting it during the report, understanding what needs to be collected as part of the case. Law enforcement focusing on drug and alcohol use instead of the crime itself. You know, we talk a lot about that victim blaming and placing the what happened on the victim, that it's their fault. And along with that, you know, the social change, the attitudes and beliefs around sexual violence, not only just the police victim blaming, but people in our community as well. Sexually violent subcultures in the porn industry. We talked about the rigid gender roles, the disrespect of a woman and how that's perceived in society, and how colonization interrupted the safe role of sorry, the safe the role of the woman. And then the kinship complexity, you know, we talked a lot about the child knowing their perpetrator, knowing their harm doer. And how could we restore safe access to cultural practices? We talked a lot about spiritual abuse and how harm could even be done at ceremonies or folks using culture. Oh, wow. Sorry, I was like, I was like ready to present on the one and it was done. Thank you all so much for listening to me and bearing with me. I get excited and I talk too fast, and I try my best to talk clear. So thank you.
Thank you, Shayla. And we are going to send the PowerPoint. So we'll have notes. Then we have like materials that support if you guys have, and we have a whole list of links that go along with this module too. So I'll be sending all of that information. I can probably get it out today. Please let me know if you're not receiving our follow-ups with the materials. We've been having a lot of firewall issues. I guess with the link, a lot of people were getting that link. So I'm worried that now not everybody is receiving the materials. So let me know. Please just email me, call me, and we'll get that figured out. So we are getting done a little bit early, but we are going to stay on for another half hour for any debriefing. Those are two very sensitive topics. So we also are open for any suggestions, and also we will not record at the, during the debrief. So if you have, want to talk or have anything to share, then the space is open for that. Is there any questions before we go? I want to thank Shayla, for that presentation. I want to thank everybody that was participating today. And Morgan, thank you. You guys, it's just an honor to share space with you all and work with you too. And it's really good to see these names that are, you know, becoming familiar and all of the participation. So take care of yourself. We'll meet again on Tuesday. And let's see that we're going to be going over next Tuesday, the social change advocacy and sexual harassment and policies and procedures. So if nobody has any questions, we really appreciate the time that you guys are all here with us today. And like I said, we'll be on for another 30 minutes if you'd like to talk about anything. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Make which.
Thank you.